Yes.
To what extent are we expected to memorize the Quran? Meaning, will we be judged for not making effort to memorize and just recite the Quran?
Good question. In terms of memorizing the Quran, it's not an obligation upon a Muslim to memorize the Quran. In fact, you may be surprised if I tell you many, if not most of the Sahaba didn't have the Quran memorized. There was a very good number who actually did have the Quran memorized, but many of the Sahaba did not have the Quran memorized. Some even said Abu Bakr didn't have the Quran memorized. Okay? So, but others, they dispute this and they say, no, actually, but anyways, whatever the point is, I'm trying to get to the point, and that is that to this extent, that some people would go as far as to say Abu Bakr, we don't have records of the fact that he memorized the Quran. So, do we have to memorize? Of course not. Is it a good deed? Of course it is. Allah talked about the memorizers of the Quran in the Quran itself. بَلْ هُوَ آيَاتٌ مُحْكَمَاتٌ فِي صُدُورِ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمَ. Rather, the Quran happens to be verses which have been perfected in the hearts of those people who've been granted knowledge. So one of the signs of the people of knowledge is that they memorize the Quran. So one of the key steps that a person has to take if they wish to get closer to Allah through knowledge is to memorize the Quran. Secondly, there's a virtue for the memorizers of the Quran, which is the hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said, اقرأ ورتل ارقع ورتل فإن منزلتك عند آخر آية تقرأها. That go and ascend, as in the levels in Jannah, ascend and recite. Your station will be the last ayah that you recite. So the more you have memorized, the higher you will have a place in Jannah, inshallah. Right? And there's other virtues also for the reciters of the Quran. One of them is, for example, they will have the opportunity to intercede on behalf of people from their relatives as well, if they are reciters of the Quran and memorizers of the Quran. So there's a lot of khayr for people who memorize the Quran. But it is not an obligation. In terms of how much you have to do, you have to obviously know Fatiha. Okay? And you have to know enough for your salawat. The more you do, the more of a relationship you'll be able to have with Allah. Because the more you'll be able to recite with the Quran. Because salah, you see, is actually called Quran in the Quran. One of the names of salah in the Quran is Quran. Right? Inna Quran al-Fajr kana mashhuda. So the Sahaba, they said Salatul Fajr. That the Quran of Fajr will be witnessed. Some of the Sahaba, they said that this is referring to the Salatul Fajr. Why? Because in Salatul Fajr, you're supposed to recite longer Quran. So the more you have committed to your memory, the more you'll be able to recite in Fajr, in the Salawat, in nighttime with Allah Azza wa Jalla.
I'm asking you because we typically just recite the Quran. So is there a time where you have to do more, like, to memorize, not all the Quran, but more ayat, more.
Is there a time where you have to do more?
To yourself, yeah. Like to what extent? If you already good to some extent, do you need to do more?
This is your personal relationship with the Quran. Depending on the more you go, the more you get reward. The lesser you go, the lesser you get reward. You won't be sinful for not doing it. But by the way, according to some scholars, it is a major sin to forget the Quran.
Once you have memorized?
This is one of the major sins that Al-Imam Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, he mentioned in his book الزواجر في اقتراف الكبائر عن اقتراف الكبائر. One of the major sins that he listed was reciting the Quran and then memorizing it. Other scholars disputed whether it's major or not, but the main thing is that some people considered it a sin to memorize and then forget, because there is a hadith to that effect.
But wouldn't that be discouraging? Like now we are scared to.
No, it means you go and do it and you stick to it,
yeah.
and you don't get occupied with something else afterwards. Because Allah says, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَاكَ سَبْعًا مِنَ الْمَثَانِ وَالْقُرْآنِ الْعَظِيمِ. We, O Prophet of Allah, we gave you 7 oft repeated verses from the Quran and also Al-Quran Al-Azim. And in the hadith we understand that Al-Quran Al-Azim in this verse was also referring to Fatiha itself. Meaning the 7 oft repeated verses, another name for that is Al-Quran Al-Azim. Okay? So, Allah said after that, since we've given you 7 oft-repeated verses, then don't extend your gazes to something else. So if a person truly cherishes the Quran, if he gets it, why would he be so foolish to occupy himself to leave it for something else?
Yeah. When
So-
you've got the best, don't.
Why would you spend time with something else in life if you really understand what the honor that Allah has granted you? You're really turning away from an honor Allah has granted you, so Allah will take it away. And you will be sinful for that, there is a level of forgetfulness that people go through naturally, right? Ayat are forgotten by people, even some of the Sahaba, we have signs that they forgot something, other person would remind them. So for that's natural, that is a natural level of forget. But we're talking about negligence.
Like deliberately leaving
The person
hafazan
just doesn't really,
and do something else.
and then they occupy themselves with something else. But if they're continuously doing what they call ta'ahud, regularly connecting themselves with the Book of Allah, then inshallah Allah is not a wrathful Lord in that way, that Allah will punish a person because they were busy with livelihood and this and that, and they couldn't recite, for example, enough every day to. Most memorizers of the Quran forget something of it.
Yeah,
So what's meant is that you haven't left it and neglected it.
totally.
Yeah.
Can I?
In terms of prioritizing tahfidh versus or hafazan versus classes, when we're the younger ones, we want to focus on the hifz. Okay?
Okay. Hafazan.
The younger ones we want to because al-hifz fi al-sighar kan-naqshi fi al-hajar, as they say. That memorizing when you're a child is like no, not sealing, but it's like imprinting it into stones. Okay? It's not going to ever go. You're always going to see that carved in from stone. You're always going to see the shape. So it's like you've carved it, And I memorized a lot of the Quran as a youngster, and some of it I memorized after the age of 10. So I remember the stuff that I memorized when I was young, 7 or 8. I have it memorized till now. I can remember those verses even if I didn't review it for years sometimes. Why? Because at that age, when you retain information, it ends up sticking with you more than what you retain as a person that's a bit older, right? So, we want to focus on the hifz with the youngsters. As they get older, and when it comes to children or even ourselves, now we want to focus more on understanding. Okay? Some people can also memorize, no problem, but I'm talking about the general focus. This is what we want to do. And when we look at the early society, Ibn Khaldun has a book called Muqaddimat Ibn Khaldun. He has a tarikh, he's a long encyclopedia on history. In that he wrote a preface called it Muqaddimah, which was later printed as a separate book called Muqaddimat Ibn Khaldun, the preface to history by Ibn Khaldun. This book became the cornerstone of modern day sociology. So sociology as a science developed off of this book by Ibn Khaldun. Okay? So in this book, one of the things he studied was the methodologies of learning within the Muslim world. Okay? So he went to Africa, he was writing about Africa and how they do their schooling, and he wrote about Morocco, so that's also part of Africa. Then he talked about Arabia, he talked about Andalus, he talked about many different areas in his time, and he wrote about how people would learn. And one of the common denominators that I found within that was every single school of learning at that time, so we can say every single educational methodology at that time focused on the Quran as the first thing. All of them, without exception. Even if they wanted to go into algebra later, they will still focus on the Quran in the beginning. If they wanted to go into anything, they would focus first and foremost with their children on the Quran. And you had a very large number of hafadah during those ages, because every child who's learning is basically a hafiz. They'll learn the Quran, they will memorize the Quran, and then they will go into whatever subject they want to go to. So, and that's one of the problems that this modern day schooling system has done to us. The O levels, the A levels, we've completely secularized the educational system. We don't have that way of keeping our kids connected to the Quran. It's not integrated. Some schools are integrated, really, they do 30, 70 or even less than that. Whereas, and another thing is the kids get lost. I mean, if they're going to be doing the Quran over 12 years, they've already forgotten the ones that they started with, right? So you start and you finish. And one of the things about Muslim educational theory, early Muslim educational theory, was they would focus on one subject at a time, right? Okay? So nowadays we do how many subjects at one time, right? So kids get confused as well. Al-Muhim, the first subject that they would start with was, so now from this they would learn about pretty much a lot of things in the world, right? You are all adults, and even now when you read the Quran, how many things do you learn, right? About the world even. You're like, oh, I didn't know about this. Yeah? I didn't know this one. But now the kids are learning about the world, and they're learning about their afterlife through the Quran. Then that's their goggles through which they're going to now see the entire world, right? There's something called bubble logic, in which they talk about how you think of the world, right? So you have a specific lens or goggle through which you view the world. Another person has another one, right? So depending on what type of lens that you have for the world, you're going to see things in a different way, with a different scope, with a different paradigm, and so on and so forth. You may be looking at the same idea, the same problem, and you may view it in a completely different way, you know. But another person will look at the same situation, and because they have a different upbringing, a different idea, a different way of thinking, and they will look at it as a, you know, something. It could even be as far as something is an insult to you, another person thinks it's a matter of praise, right? Because again, your worldview and his worldview. You want to make sure that children have the Quranic worldview. So when they're growing, when they see Darwin, they're going to look at Quran and say, what does Quran say about this theory? What is the story of Adam alayhi salam? How did he begin? How did he not? That's their worldview. You've given it to them. But if you teach them science and mathematics and pragmatism, and if you teach them all of it, and then they go to high school and college, and if they end up going to scientific fields, or they end up going to anthropology or something, then God forbid.
Yeah.
They're going to be looking at the Quran through that, and then it's going to be too late.
Yeah.
Right?
True.
So, with the children, we want to start with the Quran. As we get older, then we want to do it the other way around. Meaning, yes, you can do a little bit of hifz, but more focus on the ilm, because now it's wajib for you to know.
Yes.
Now it's time for you should have already done the Quran at the time where it wouldn't be obligatory for you to know about your salah, about your zakat, about your siyam, about your inner self, about all of these other things. I hope that answers.